Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we're speaking with Mr. Andy Worthington about Guantanamo Bay. Mr. Worthington is an investigative journalist, activist, and author. He is the author of The Guantanamo Files, the stories of the 774 detainees in America's illegal prison, and a director of the film Outside the Law, Stories from Guantanamo. He is a co-founder of CloseGuantanamo.org and the director of We Stand with Shocker. You can follow his work at andyworthington.co.uk and at closeguantanamo.org and at westandwithshocker.org. You can find him on Facebook under Andy Worthington and on Twitter at Guantanamo Andy. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Gitmo. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's very good to be talking to you.
So let's start off with the basics. What is Guantanamo Bay and when did it start?
Well, so Guantanamo Bay is an offshore prison set up by the Bush administration in January 2002 to hold people who were seized in the war on terror that the Bush administration declared after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. And they chose to locate it in the on the naval base that they have in Guantanamo Bay, which is a large bay in the east of Cuba, which is in American control as a result of the wars that involved Cuba, over 100 years ago, and it's actually subject to a lease that cannot be broken unless both parties agree to it. So, of course, the U.S. doesn't want to let go of it, and Cuba doesn't want America to have it. But they have this naval base there, which they've had for all this time, and they set up a prison there. And the reason they set it up on a U.S. base, which is on another country's land, is that they thought that it would enable them to escape the scrutiny of the U.S. courts. And the reason that they wanted to escape the scrutiny of the U.S. courts is because they were planning to do things to the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay that they wouldn't have been allowed to do under normal circumstances. And once you start to just scrape away at that a little bit, you realize that they're wanting to torture and abuse people because, you're not allowed to do that under normal circumstances. And that's really one of the horrific stories of the post 9/11 response of the Bush administration to the terrible events of September 11th, was that they basically tore up all the domestic and international rules and treaties regarding the treatment of prisoners. They started flying people around the world. They set up their own torture prisons, black sites run by the CIA. They involved other countries torturing people on their behalf. And a large number of these people ended up in Guantanamo, along with a kind of general population of waifs and strays and nobodies and lowly foot soldiers that they'd also picked up. And so, you've had from the beginning this place really is a very powerful symbol of the United States flight from the rule of law. Breaking, as I say, really every rule governing how people should be treated.
Yeah, I guess the U.S. having a naval base at Guantanamo Bay goes back to the end of the Spanish-American War and the Platt Amendment of the early 1900s. But you mentioned in there that the U.S. is breaking international law with the way it's treating prisoners there. Now, I don't want to get too graphic, but can you give a sense to our listeners of how the U.S. government is treating prisoners there and the ways in which it is breaking international law?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, we don't really have to get into gruesome details to explain why what's been happening is wrong. The essential point that everyone needs to remember is that there are only two ways that you can deprive somebody of their liberty if you're, claiming to be a country that respects the rule of law and has any kind of civilized values. So the first of those is that you are arrested in connection with a crime. You are then charged and put on trial. That is supposed to be a speedy process. And when that happens, if you're convicted, you get sentenced and you serve a prison sentence. The other way is that you're seized in wartime and you are taken off the battlefield, and you are protected by the Geneva Conventions, which, perhaps most importantly, that forbid the torture and abuse of prisoners. And you can then be held until the end of hostilities. But what the United States did after 9/11 was that it said that it wasn't going to hold people according to either of these criteria. And what it was intending to do, as well as evade the scrutiny of the U.S. courts, was to hold people who literally had no rights whatsoever as human beings. The reason that we, developed ways of treating people and codifying ways of treating them was to avoid descending into the depths of terrible, abuse. And yet, what the Bush administration set up was an absolute recipe for abuse. By, as I say, trying to make sure from the beginning that these were people who were stripped of every single right that they possessed as human beings. And it is really, it's shocking when you look back to those early days to realize that the Bush administration had no intention of doing anything apart from holding these people forever if that's what they wished. They didn't in the beginning intend for, necessarily that they would ever release them. And these are people that you're holding without charge or trial and that you're not holding according to the Geneva Conventions. So it's rolling us back to some terrible situation that prevailed really many, many centuries ago when people had no rights. It took 2.5 years for the lawyers who had worked out from the beginning that something terrible was going on to get the cases that they brought to try and get habeas corpus rights for the prisoners. The rule that you cannot be imprisoned arbitrarily, which goes back to its foundation 800 years ago in England. So they went through the lower courts, they went through the appeals courts, they finally got it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in what demonstrates what a strange situation this was, what a strange and lawless place Guantanamo was, gave habeas corpus rights to prisoners who were seized in wartime, essentially. So they weren't being held according to the Geneva Conventions. But the judges recognized that they were literally being held without rights, that if a prisoner was sitting in Guantanamo saying, you've got the wrong guy, there was nothing that he could do. There was no route out. There was nobody that he could say anything to who would be able to address his complaint. So that's how they ended up being given habeas corpus rights. The Bush administration actually, immediately connived with Congress to remove those habeas corpus rights, and it took another 4 years for the prisoners to again get in front of the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court gave them constitutionally guaranteed habeas corpus rights. And that did lead for a while to the courts actually ordering a few dozen of these men to be released, which is really the only time that the law has ever managed to deal effectively with the lawlessness of Guantanamo. And what actually happened in the end was that appeals court judges, a bunch of very ideologically motivated right-wing appeals court judges, actually rewrote the rules on habeas corpus to make sure that the prisoners couldn't win any more of their cases and actually have judges order them to be released. And that particular window came to an end. It lasted for really two or 3 years. But to go back to what was happening at Guantanamo, what you're doing when you remove rights from people is that, it opened the floodgates for the United States to treat these people in a way that was barbaric and that isn't normally allowed. And there were various programs introduced at various times in the early days of Guantanamo in particular that were, designed in a rather cruel and inept way to try and break people's resistance or perceived resistance. And actually, if you want to get good intelligence from people, you have to build a rapport with them. What they did instead was that they basically got advice from psychologists who told them that actually the best way to do things was to torture people. So they stripped them naked. They kept them awake for. They had a thing that they called the frequent flyer program. So they moved prisoners from cell to cell every few hours to make sure that they could never sleep for more than a few minutes at a time. And they did this for days, weeks, even months in some cases, which, has a rather ruinous effect on people's mental health. They played on prisoners' phobias, so they stripped them naked, because Muslims particularly didn't like that. They got women personnel to deal inappropriately with them because, again, that was something that they knew that Muslim prisoners were really not going to like. They turned up the air conditioning really high, or they made the cells really cold. They had all these things going on for quite a while there, which, of course, are all, awful things that nobody should be doing who, as I said before, regards themselves as civilized and respects the rule of law.
So aside from the Geneva Conventions and a few clauses in the U.S. Constitution pertaining to habeas corpus and due process rights, is there anything else in either U.S. law or international law that you would point to as proving that Guantanamo is illegal?
Well, I mean, technically, in terms of the U.S. law, it's not illegal. What the Congress did a few days after 9/11 was that they said the president could go after anyone that he thought was connected to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, the people responsible for the 9/11 attacks. It was quite a broad remit. Now, it didn't specifically say you have the right to then imprison them, but what happened was that in June 2004, when a case reached the Supreme Court, not the same case as the one where the prisoners first got habeas corpus rights, but another case about detention, the Supreme Court told the government, you can hold these people that you have gone after from this legislation that was passed straight after 9/11. It's called the Authorization for Use of Military Force. They said you can hold people until the end of hostilities as an outcome of this legislation. So actually what the Supreme Court did then was they set up a kind of parallel version of the Geneva Conventions, because under the Geneva Conventions you are allowed to hold people until the end of hostilities. But, there was really no adequate explanation for why the Geneva Conventions themselves would not have been, were not adequate to cover this. So it was a bit like the Supreme Court giving some sign of credibility to something that I don't think really needed it in the first place. It would have been much more sensible to have said to the administration, you're doing this in the wrong way. If you're going to hold people who are allegedly involved in terrorism, then you should be charging them with crimes and putting them on trial in federal court, whereas what they did, of course, was set up this ridiculous military commission trial system at Guantanamo, which has never been an adequate form of justice. It's never really been a very well-functioning system at all, to be honest. And they should have said to the government, in terms of holding prisoners of war, you should just obey the Geneva Conventions. It would have been much more sensible.
Yeah, could you go into detail a bit more about the Guantanamo Military Commission and how exactly detainees are prosecuted there?
Well, the military commissions, as far as I can see, were particularly, were a particular idea of Dick Cheney and his lawyer, David Addington, in the early days. I mean, they were introduced in November 2001, and the intention was to drag something up from American history that would bypass all of these inconvenient situations that had arisen with the federal court system. And primarily, it was intended that people would be able to be prosecuted fairly swiftly with no concern as to whether information had been obtained through means that was not allowable. So in other words, that torture and abuse would not be excluded, and would lead swiftly to executions. And that never happened. I mean, from the beginning, they ran into problems. They appointed prosecutors, military prosecutors, and judges who had a look at what they were expected to do, and then said, "Actually, I can't have any part in this. This isn't what I signed up to do." I signed up to obey the U.S. Constitution as it is enacted by our leaders, not to obey our leaders if what they're doing is flouting the U.S. Constitution. So principled, military personnel have resisted the injustice from the beginning. And it took until June 2006 for the Bush administration to suffer a major blow with its military commissions. So no one had been prosecuted, in this 4.5-year period. And then the Supreme Court, in another one of its interventions, told the government very frankly that their military commissions contravened the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the Geneva Conventions, and that essentially that they were illegal, and to go away and have a really deep think about this. I must say what the Supreme Court also did at that point was to remind the U.S. government that there are no circumstances under which you can hold people without them having rights, without them having the right not to be abused. And that's common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. And the kind of alarming thing is that for the period from February 2002, when President Bush issued a memo saying that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, until 4 years and 4 months later, when the Supreme Court said, you have forgotten that Common Article 3 prevents the torture and abuse of prisoners. For that whole period, there was nothing preventing the United States government from torturing people. That's how it all happened. And that really, for me would be very high up in the list of reasons for these senior officials from Bush downwards to be prosecuted, was because they very deliberately, for a period of 4 years and 4 months, had swept away all the obstacles preventing the torture and abuse of prisoners. But the military commissions were brought back after the Supreme Court told the government that they were illegal. They were resurrected with the help of Congress. They then limped on through the rest of the Bush period and secured a few results. Then Obama came in and he froze them while he reviewed them, and then he unwisely decided that he was going to bring them back to life again. And all through this, people with senior people with knowledge of the law told them that the war crimes that they were using were not actual war crimes. They'd been invented by Congress when Congress had revived the military commission. So these are things like providing material support for terrorism and conspiracy, which are crimes in federal court, but are not war crimes. And in fact, it's only been in the last few years that judges have finally done what these people said they would do, which is they've revisited the handful of results that have been achieved in the military commissions, and they've struck down, about half of them. And we were only talking about, 7 decisions that have ever been reached in this whole long period. So, this is a kind of long and complicated story, but I hope you're really getting the gist of it and that your listeners do understand what a ridiculous, broken system, what an insult to justice it is, and what a great shame it is for the United States to have implemented and struggled on with something that is so unfit for purpose, such a mockery of justice. And yet, I suppose really another facet of Guantanamo, because that's what Guantanamo also is as well. A shame and a disgrace for claims that the United States is a country founded on the rule of law that respects the rule of law, and something that ultimately just, doesn't work.
Right. Now, I want to take a look at other governments for a moment, and let's set the U.S. government aside, and we'll come back to them. But what involvement and cooperation have we seen from other governments, and what resistance have we seen from the Cuban government?
Well, the Cuban government, has really nothing that it can do about it because of this lease that was set up in the 1930s that can't be broken unless both parties agree to it. So, their hands are tied really on this. I mean, they could try and provoke a kind of war with the United States, but I don't think that would be very wise. So there's nothing legally they can do about it. A much bigger and I think more interesting question you asked is about other countries. And, what really happened from the start of the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks was that clearly the United States put pressure on everybody to cooperate with them, to help them in their in their pursuit of the people who were responsible. And at the very beginning, although I think people who were looking very closely would have been worried that the response to this terrible terrorist attack was in the hands of George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld. Not a bunch of people that you would really want to trust with anything. But, people were supportive. Of course, America's allies were supportive in the beginning, and some countries were extremely supportive. I think you'll find that the UK was the closest of the United States allies in working willingly with the United States on dealing with this newly perceived terrorist threat, and understanding that the law, would have to be bent, if not broken, in ways that people would deal with it. Obviously, other countries were put under pressure by the United States. If they didn't want to cooperate, then they were bullied, cajoled, and threatened. But, a lot of people ended up sharing intelligence, ignoring rendition flights passing through their airspace or using their airports, or became much more involved in it. In other words, they were actually actively working with the CIA and with various U.S. departments to capture people, to render them, to send them to places where they were going to be tortured, to send people to interrogate them in Guantanamo, all of this. And, the kind of crucial thing, I think, with all of this is that the only country that, on the face of it at least, didn't accept that it was doing anything wrong was the United States. So the United States had these, the authorization for use of military force that I've mentioned. The Bush administration also sought and received advice that it wanted to hear internally from people who were very much on board with the program, to tell them, for example, that torture wasn't torture unless it led to death, and that therefore it was okay for the CIA to use it. That was John Yoo, who was working in the Justice Department, who's a law professor at Berkeley. There were a lot of insiders, the people working with the administration, who told them that they weren't doing anything wrong. Now, regardless of whether those opinions ought to be worthless, they actually are legally, they're valid, in the sense that what you find is that legal people argue about whether or not things went too far, but they're not describing things in black and white as being clearly illegal when they should have been. I would say pretty much every other country around the world didn't have this kind of sleight of hand by legal experts. So everybody knew that what they were doing was wrong. Everybody knew that what they were doing was illegal. And it's one of the things that's made it very difficult to get accountability in other countries. As one route of trying to get to the Bush administration is because all these other countries that were involved are desperate to shut down any discussion of what they did, as I say, because it was clearly wrong. It's only the United States where they were trying to paper over it and pretend that the terrible things they were doing were somehow justifiable.
How many people are in Guantanamo now, and who are they?
There are 80 men left in Guantanamo, so that's roughly 1/10 of the people who have been held there throughout its long and ignoble history. So, the total number of people who've been held in the military, by the military at Guantanamo since the beginning, is 779 people. There is at least one other man, maybe more, who were held secretly for a period of about 6 months by the CIA in a secret prison within Guantanamo. But it's 779 is the official military figure, and 80 are left. Now, of those men who are left, just 10 of them are facing or have faced trials. And, those 10 can be added to the, if I recall correctly, the 7 men who've been through the military commission system one way or another. And like I say, 4 of those convictions have been overturned by the courts. So, first of all, it's worth looking at the incredibly small number of people who have had any kind of involvement with prosecution out of the total number of people held. And it's, the figure we're looking at with the overturned rulings is 13 out of 779. Really an extremely poor result. So, you've got the 10 that are currently facing trials or have, one of them was convicted under Bush and is appealing and has appealed, the layers of his conviction seem to be being removed one by one as the appeals go ahead. And a couple of guys have had plea deals. So that leaves 70 other people held at Guantanamo, and of those, 30 of them have been approved for release. So that leaves another 40 who haven't. Now, the ones who've been approved for release, 15 of them are left over from the much larger number of men who were approved for release in 2009, 2010. When Obama took office, he basically inherited, this nightmare prison, and he wasn't sure who he had, and there wasn't really that much ready paperwork to hand to really confirm who he had. So he appointed a task force of people from senior government departments and the agencies to meet every week to look through the cases of the prisoners and to tell him who he had and what he should do with them. And they told him that 2/3 of the men that he was holding, which was about 240 when he took office, that 2/3 of them should be freed, that 36 of them should be prosecuted, and that the rest, which was 48 men, were in this strange other position where, as the task force put it, they were too dangerous to release, but there was insufficient evidence to put them on trial. That's not really the kind of thing that you want to hear if you have any respect for the rule of law. If you haven't got enough evidence to put somebody on trial, then, it's not evidence. It's something else. It's rumors, it's hearsay, it's information extracted through dubious means. But that was the situation that the task force presented President Obama with. So the majority of those people approved for release have been released over the years, and there have been, some serious stops and starts during Obama's 7 years as to how much he's been opposed by Congress, how much he's been interested in spending political capital actually dealing with Guantanamo. But he's got all of those people out apart from these 15. The other 15 approved for release are people who have been approved for release by the latest review process. So this was triggered by the fact that when he accepted that the task force told him these people are too dangerous to release, these 48 men, they're too dangerous to release, but we can't put them on trial. He said, okay, well, I'm going to authorize holding them, but he clearly recognized that, that lawyers and NGOs and all kinds of critics were going to tear him apart if he didn't provide some other means that these people could challenge the basis of their detention. So he said, we're going to give you periodic reviews of your cases in which we'll look at your cases and see whether we still think you're too dangerous to release. This took a long time to get going. He promised in March 2011 that these reviews would take place within a year. They didn't begin for nearly 3 years after he made that promise. At the end of 2013, they began, and they've been taking place. They took place slowly. Now they're taking place 2 a week because Obama's running out of time. And he is actually going through the cases of all of these people. And the situation he set up, the periodic review boards, are very much like a parole scenario. The one exception being that, when you go before a parole board, you've been convicted in a court of something. These people haven't, but the parole board is doing the same thing. It's establishing whether it can be regarded as, relatively safe to release them because these people apologize for what they've done. They promise that they will behave in future. They don't bear any malice towards the United States. They just want to get on with their lives. And actually, it's been a very successful process. And to date, of the 40-odd cases that have been reviewed, there have been 33 decisions taken, and 24 men have been recommended for release, and just 9 have had their detention upheld. So, that shows that the too dangerous to release tag was really a little bit of an exaggeration, to put it mildly. And so 9 of those men have been freed, and 15 others are awaiting release. They're the 15 men. And the 40 others are all facing these periodic reviews. So there are about a dozen men who are awaiting decisions. There are about another dozen men who have got their reviews scheduled to take place over the next month or so. And they're going to carry on like that. All of these 40 men will have their cases reviewed by the fall, is what the Obama administration has promised, and I have no reason to think that won't happen. So the question now is, how many of these people will end up being approved for release? At the moment, the success rate in the decisions that have been taken is 73%. It's probably not going to end up being that much, because I should say that some of the men who are having their periodic reviews were men who were put forward for prosecution by the task force until the basis for prosecution collapsed because of those appeals court rulings when they kicked out the convictions against some of the prisoners for having invented war crimes. So there's a mixture of, the too dangerous to release people are actually regarded as less significant than some people who were formally put forward for prosecution. So it's a mix of them, and I think we can expect that, some proportion of these men are also going to be approved for release. And that's really key for, will President Obama be able to close the prison? How many men will he have left at the end of all this? And, he's going to be left with dozens. Maybe it's around 50 people. Maybe it's around 40. And then, then it's the question, how does he actually close it?
So when you talk about people being released or freed, how many of these people over the years who have been released or freed, or even people who are still there, how many of them were innocent all along? They were innocent from the start. And for those who were innocent, how did they end up there, and what forms of recourse have they had, if any?
Well, it's obviously difficult to tell exactly how many innocent people were held and how many, because everything was done in such a way that it's so vague and so imprecise. If you capture people in wartime who aren't wearing uniforms, what you're supposed to do, and what the United States did up to the Iraq War, was that the first Gulf War, what you do is that if people are not dressed in military uniform, you have what are called competent tribunals, according to the Geneva Conventions, where pretty soon after capture, you hold these tribunals where you let them come before you and call witnesses and say, look, I'm a farmer. I was driving my cart through the middle of your battlefield and you picked me up. When they did that in the first Gulf War, they held over 1,000 tribunals, and in 3/4 of the cases, they found that they detained civilians instead of combatants, and they sent them home. They didn't do that after 9/11. They explicitly were told, the military, that these tribunals were not taking place. So, with this kind of idiotic arrogance that the Bush administration had, anybody that they captured was regarded as guilty, and there was supposed to be no process, of establishing whether that was true or not. So years later, they're trying to work out who they've got in Guantanamo, and they have no idea who they've got. When they arrived there, they didn't know. Their basis of trying to find out who the hell they had, which was by, largely through, coercive interrogations of the prisoners themselves, was not the kind of thing that was going to yield accurate information. So they, honestly, nobody knows. But, the military didn't know. If you accept that, some of the people who are held lie and some of them don't, then I would say, and the result of the research I've done over all these years, I would suggest that, a significant minority, something less than half the prisoners, but not too much less than half the prisoners. Maybe less than that, maybe a third. But, hundreds and hundreds of the men who were held at Guantanamo were very literally nothing to do with terrorism or the military whatsoever. So these were, people who had been in Pakistan, for example, where a lot of the prisoners were seized, who had been working in Pakistan. But when the Americans were pressurizing the Pakistanis to hand over people for their new prison at Guantanamo, they were pointing out all of these people to them, people who were teachers or were working in companies. In Afghanistan, not everybody who was there was a soldier. So there were people who were there who were doing missionary work, for example. There were people who were doing humanitarian aid work because of the terrible situation in Afghanistan. So I think hundreds of people were literally in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the United States government was offering substantial bounty payments in that part of the world, $5,000 a head, which is, tends to lead people to hand over strangers that they can dress up as what the U.S. wants. I would say that, one of the big problems is that there's obviously a lot of people that were sent to Guantanamo were foot soldiers for the Taliban or for the Arab forces that were supporting the Taliban. But these people are soldiers, essentially. So why are they dressed up as terrorists? If you ask, an uninformed American citizen to this day who's held at Guantanamo, they say, well, the terrorists, and our government is keeping us safe from the terrorists. But these people had no knowledge of terrorism. They had no involvement in terrorism. They were fighting in Afghanistan in a civil war against the Northern Alliance that was then interrupted by 9/11, at which point everybody who was in Afghanistan, once the U.S. invaded, automatically became an opponent of the United States. And sure, some of those people had a real grudge against the United States for its foreign policy and willingly engaged in efforts at combating the U.S. invaders after October 2001. But they're not terrorists. They never were. There's only ever been an extremely small number of people genuinely accused of involvement in terrorism at Guantanamo, just a few dozen, I would say. And that's one of the great, it's one of the great disappointments to me how pervasive, how strong and pervasive the propaganda and lies that the Bush administration told about the prison at the beginning have been to dismantle. That, as I say, to this day, far too many American citizens have failed to ask any piercing questions about what they've been told about Guantanamo.
At the beginning of this podcast, we mentioned Shaka Amir. Could you explain who he is?
Sure, yeah. Shaka is a British resident of Saudi origin who had traveled to Afghanistan for humanitarian aid. He'd gone there with his family, with a British citizen in his family as well. They'd both gone out there a few months before the 9/11 attacks. And, when everything descended into chaos, then he was apprehended trying to leave Afghanistan. And from the moment that they had him in custody, he fought for the prisoners' rights in a way that, it wasn't unique for people to do that. But he's a very charismatic and forceful character. He's a very intelligent man. And so he was capable of rallying the prisoners in opposition to the injustice that, in the way they were being treated. So he was basically a thorn in the side of the U.S. authorities for all the time that they held him. But they persuaded themselves that because he was such a big man in detention, that meant that he had been a big man in Al-Qaeda. And, really there's no evidence to back up those claims. In fact, when you look at the information on him, and anybody, can look up the files that were released by WikiLeaks in 2011, which Bradley Manning has supplied to WikiLeaks, which are classified military files, which explain who said what about whom at Guantanamo. And the same names turn up regularly of people who have been identified as people who told lies about their fellow prisoners. And, they're the only ones in Shaka Amir's file explaining that he was a member of Al-Qaeda, that he knew Osama bin Laden. All of this rubbish, which we know because the same rubbish is found in other people's files as well from unreliable witnesses. And, but, the United States kind of refused to, across the board, recognize that this was a man who, although he'd been trouble to them in detention, wasn't somebody who had done anything before or was going to be a threat to them afterwards. So all the efforts to get him released, just led nowhere, really. He was told towards the end of not even the end of the Bush administration. He was told in 2007, I believe, that the U.S. didn't want to hold him. Then the task force that Obama set up approved him for release. But everybody else British went home, and he stayed there. And it was obviously because there were people somewhere within the administration who weren't going to sign off on his release. Basically, it takes interagency consensus to get someone approved for release from Guantanamo, and somebody somewhere didn't want him to go. So I got involved in basically a campaign with a large inflatable figure of Shaka Armour, which we took around, and we got support from MPs and from a lot of celebrities to try and get his release. And also MPs became involved, in significant numbers. They set up their own parliamentary group, a cross-party parliamentary group. Some of them came to the US to call for his release. Newspapers got involved. I mean, the biggest right-wing tabloid newspaper in the country got behind his case, not because they necessarily thought that he was, a good man, but they were fixated on the importance of the rule of law, which is, obviously to be commended. But, we had this really strange alliance of campaigners and activists and MPs, this right-wing newspaper, all pushing for his release. And, eventually last October, he was freed and came home to the UK and is now, trying to put his life together again, which, I think must be very difficult when you've been separated for so long from your family in particular. His kids are all teenagers. They've grown up without him. They don't, they don't know who he is. How do you rebuild those kinds of relationships?
No, it must be extremely difficult and something that very few people can imagine having to go through. But before we wrap up, I want to focus on something that you've mentioned in passing a few times, and that is the possibility of closing the Guantanamo Bay facility. So what efforts have there been to close it in the past, and why hasn't it been closed yet? What's been so difficult about getting it closed?
Well, Obama promised to close it, within a year when he took office. He announced it on his second day in office, January the 22nd, 2009. But he hadn't come up with a coherent plan at that point, and he didn't have one. I mean, he first of all, he appointed this task force to tell him who he had, because it's not in his defense, it's not as simple as some people would like it to be, which is that you either charge the people you've got or you release them. The problem is that, having failed to correctly identify some people as soldiers and to hold them according to the Geneva Conventions doesn't mean that they might not be soldiers, and they might not be soldiers who in some way bear some kind of grudge against the United States, and that it would be better not to release them. So, he was waiting to find out what he was advised about who he was holding. And because he didn't really do anything, then it gave the Republicans the opportunity to rally against him by using Guantanamo as an issue on which they could say, he's weak on terrorism, he's weak on national security, he won't defend you, we will. And it was very easy for Republicans, with breathtaking cynicism. I mean, the way that they've behaved has been awful, but he has been weak. But it was easy for them to do that because they weren't in power. When they were in power, increasingly as the Bush administration went on in its second term, Bush got more and more and more flack internationally and to some extent domestically for what he was doing. Because when you're in charge of it, you have to take responsibility for it. So they've behaved very badly. But like I say, he has so often backed down when he should have seized the initiative. And he's done that because, sometimes his advisors have told him bluntly, it's not worth it. I think that's what Rahm Emanuel did in the early days. Or he's worked out it's not worth me starting a fight on this issue with the Republicans because, it's going to be something that's more difficult than I want. But that's led to us being, 7 years down the line with the place still open. What he has clearly, realized towards the end is that, he promised to close it. I have no doubt that he doesn't want it open. I don't think that he's a believer that a place that's, based on indefinite detention without charge or trial where such terrible things have happened, and which, in a way is still a form of torture because, holding people who have no idea when, if ever, they'll be released is a form of mental torture. I don't believe that he thinks that's useful. He has resisted every call by Republicans to send anyone new to Guantanamo. This is not to say that everything that he does is in respect of the rule of law, because he and his administration have gone with what the defense people and the intelligence people have told him, which is that it's much better taking people out with drones rather than bothering with all the mess of, capturing them and then having to hold them and interrogate them. So he is by no means blameless for the way that he's behaved. But in terms of Guantanamo, he's been trying to close it recently, and he's obviously at the point now where he wants it shut before he leaves office, if he can achieve that. Now, the problem is that over the years, and it's many years now, every year the Congress enacts a prohibition against him moving anyone to the U.S. mainland from Guantanamo for any reason, meaning, bluntly, that he cannot close the facility unless he gets Congress to play ball with him, or unless he can do it through an executive order. But I'm not sure that he can do, even if it's, even if he's able to do that, where he would then get the money and the cooperation to find facilities on the U.S. mainland that unilaterally, without the support of Congress, he's going to use as a prison for holding people that he's brought from Guantanamo so that he can shut that facility. I don't know. I mean, this latest review process, the periodic review boards, which is quite drastically reducing the number of men held, I would like to see the number of people that he's left with as less than 30, because I think that would be appropriate. But, it could be 50 of the men who are still held. It won't be that. Maybe it could be 40, whatever. We're looking at, many dozens of people. And as I say, only 10 are facing trials. They might be able to come up with proposed trials for a few more. They've got other people that are still, as they regard, too dangerous to release. They want to bring them to the U.S. mainland. They want to hold people on the U.S. mainland held without charge or trial. That goes against everything that we believe about how people should be held and what the U.S. Constitution allows. With colleagues of mine, we believe that if he gets to bring them to U.S. mainland, they will have new opportunities under the U.S. Constitution to very fundamentally challenge the right of the U.S. government to hold anybody indefinitely without charge or trial on the U.S. mainland. And and that would be an interesting turn of events. And to be honest, I do think that if people can't be charged now after all this time, then we should be looking at them more as people who are held in connection with a war that can't go on forever. That you send people home because they're not that dangerous. That's what happens. You end up letting people go. But I don't know how it's going to work out. It doesn't look like Congress is going to play ball. And at the moment, we have to gauge, well, how important is this? Could he have most of it done and hand it over to a Democratic successor, if that's who takes the White House? He could. That would certainly, imply a continuity, although it would be a shame for him to have so spectacularly failed to fulfill his promise. But are we going to get a Democrat in the White House? Or are we going to get, one of the Republicans who is contending for it? And, that doesn't look like it would be very helpful in terms of getting Guantanamo closed. So I'm not sure which way it's going to go.
Yeah, no, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and it looks like they'll be the respective Democratic and Republican nominees. They're both horrible on this issue. Trump wants to step up the use of Guantanamo, and Hillary has opposed closing Guantanamo every step of the way. So,
yeah, I think she's more supportive of it than that. But I still think it would be better for Obama to do whatever it takes if he can. But as I say, I'm not sure how practical it would be with all the expense and and the mobilization of prisons and people to move people from Guantanamo to the U.S. mainland if he has the resolute opposition of Congress. But it's got to close one of these days. There are people in Congress and other dark forces in the U.S. who love having a prison where they can hold people without any due process rights whatsoever, where they can effectively hold people their entire lives without having to prove that they did anything. And, that is the hallmark of a totalitarian regime. That is the hallmark of a dictatorship. And the fact that there are people in the United States, some of them in quite high positions, who like that, is something that should trouble everybody, and that we should bring to an end sooner rather than later. It's been 14 years that this terrible, terrible mistake has existed, and every day that it's still open, it should be a great source of shame and a disgrace for all American people who respect the rule of law, justice, fairness.
No, it's horrible, and it seems like some of the most vocal objections to closing it and some of the biggest scare tactics surround the idea of having these prisoners on U.S. soil and trying them in U.S. courts, and it's just so unfortunate that those scare tactics are going
all
everywhere.
of it's just ridiculous scaremongering. What they've done is, over the years, they've portrayed these people as superhumans somehow, but they're not just like, if you're a terrorist, you're a pretty despicable human being who's decided to murder civilians for some political aim. There's nothing lofty about that, but they've allowed the people allegedly responsible for that to portray themselves as some kind of holy warriors, which is ridiculous. They've turned everything on its head. The scaremongering that has been done for years and years, try and tell the American people, you can't bring these people to the U.S. mainland. You can't hold them securely in our ridiculously safe supermax prisons. You can't put them on trial in courtrooms because Al-Qaeda will bomb our courtrooms from the skies. Every time they say those things, people around the world are laughing at how ridiculous they look, at how ridiculous they sound. But, these are the kind of people who don't care what anybody in the rest of the world thinks of them. But honestly, that is what's happening. It's people are looking at him and going, do you know how ridiculous you sound? Do you know how scared and cowardly you sound? This isn't the behavior of people who are, strong and right. This is ridiculous scaremongering.
For those who are interested in learning more about your work and learning more about Guantanamo, what do you recommend they check out?
Well, I'm always happy for people to come and visit my websites because, I've been writing about Guantanamo for 10 years. There are millions of words that I've written about Guantanamo and the people held there on my website. Close Guantanamo has been going for over 4 years. There's a lot of stuff there. There are lists of who's held. There are lists of the periodic review boards. There's everything people need to know, really, to dig down into this story, to understand what's been done, for American listeners to understand what's been done in their name. And hopefully to end up in the position that those of us who've been working to get the prison closed have understood for all this time that it's very fundamentally wrong to have a facility like this and to be holding people under these circumstances. It's really not acceptable and, not helpful for the United States' reputation abroad, not helpful for the United States' safety and security, but, most of all, not helpful for the health of the United States as a nation that is strong enough to understand that justice is important, that once you start messing with it and trifling with it and breaking it, as has happened since the 9/11 attacks, you end up impoverished. You end up morally compromised, and that these are important issues. And I think the kind of craziness that you see around people like Donald Trump and the kind of attitudes that some American people have to torture, that they still have this gung-ho attitude of how necessary it is and not how stupid and brutal and wrong and counterproductive it is all symptomatic of nobody having brought this to an end and definitively said, this must not happen again. Oh, and by the way, we need to hold people accountable in high office who implemented all this stuff in the first place.
Right. No, accountability for people like that would be great. And let's hope it gets closed sometime soon. I hope to have you back on in the coming months to be able to celebrate. I'm happy to talk again on it. It's been very nice for you to listen to me give this big, long explanation. I don't always get this long to talk, but as I'm sure you realize, it has a lot of subtleties and nuances, this story, however much the blunt truth is that it's wrong from top to bottom. All the things that have happened over the years, some of them just sound like, dystopian fables. Some of the stuff is so ridiculous you can't imagine it's real, but it all is. Right. No, it's a very complicated and messy situation. And I want to encourage everybody to go check out wakeupcallpodcast.com/Gitmo. And that's the show notes page for this episode. And we'll link to all of the resources mentioned over the course of this interview, so that for those who want to learn more about this beyond just this interview, they will have all of those links in one place. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Gitmo is the place to go. And I also want to encourage everybody, while they're on our website, to sign up for our email list, and also to subscribe on iTunes, so you can make sure to never miss an episode, and to follow us on Twitter at WUC Podcast. So on that note, Andy, thanks for joining us. And as I said, hopefully we'll get to have you back on soon so we can celebrate the closing of Guantanamo. But even if it stays open, we'll have you back on as there are future developments to discuss.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.